Hey, how's it going everyone? I'm White Pointer, and since I've been doing this series of videos answering viewer questions, one game has been mentioned more than any other, the legendary Chrono Trigger. It was one of the last games developed by the Japanese Squaresoft team that saw an international release on the Super Nintendo, although it was only released in North America. And yeah, as an Australian, I'm still pretty bummed about that, but at least there's plenty of ways to play it now. Anyway, so many viewers left comments about this game that I decided to go ahead and just make an entire video dedicated to it that answers all the questions in one go and explains any other notable visual effects. So if you've ever asked a question about Chrono Trigger, and I know there's been a lot of you, then this video is for you, and maybe you'll get some answers to some stuff you hadn't even thought about before. As we go, why not try to guess the answer before it's revealed? In order to do this, I played the entire game from start to finish. Yeah, it's a tough job, but someone's got to do it, and I chose not to use pre-made save files as I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything cool to cover. A disclaimer though before we start, this video is going to contain spoilers, including the ending, so that's a heads up if you've never played or finished Chrono Trigger and you intend to do so. With that out of the way, let's get stuck into it. What better place to start than right from the title screen? It's a pretty iconic one as the pendulum swings before coming to a stop and the Chrono Trigger logo appears. There's more going on in this short sequence than you might have realised, so let's examine it. Time is a valuable thing, watch it fly by as the pendulum swings. Sorry, couldn't resist. The pendulum is a Mode 7 background as it swings and zooms out. This is the part you probably already knew about, especially if you've seen Retro Game Mechanics Explains Mode 7 video. The sea appears on top of the pendulum, but is translucent and you can see the pendulum behind it. This is a sprite using one of the 4 sprite palettes that support color maths, and is placed on the subscreen with color averaging applied in order to make it transparent. It stays on the subscreen until it stops moving, at which point it moves over to the main screen. The rest of the letters of the word Chrono then scroll out from behind the sea. These are also all sprites, and when they first appear, all the tiles are sitting on top of each other. As the letters move out, however, they push apart at different rates to form the word. Something else interesting happens behind the scenes when those letters appear though. The game switches to Mode 2, and puts the pendulum onto Background Layer 2. If you're familiar with the functions of the Super Nintendo's background modes, you might know where this is headed. So after this, the word Trigger scrolls in from right to left with a wavy animation on it, and this is on Background Layer 1. The text in the tile map is already written in a wavy font, but it's given the animation using vertical offset per tile to move individual columns of tiles up and down, as Mode 2 is one of the background modes that supports this feature. Without offset per tile, the animation would look like this. Not nearly as cool looking. So how about that? In just this short sequence, there's already multiple tricks being used, and we haven't even started playing the game yet. The opening chapter of the game itself shows some neat examples of the color math circuit being used to do color addition. Usually we see it doing color averaging to create transparency effects like we saw in the intro, and also the various weather effects you see throughout a lot of the game, like these clouds on the overworld map, and especially the smog once you get to 2300 AD. But here we see examples of color addition being used, with the sunlight beams that are coming through the windows. You can even open and close the curtain in Chrono's room and the effect changes. It's pretty neat. You see this effect used a lot during the game, usually to shine light through windows, though one specific one I think looks particularly impressive is the stained glass window in the courtroom during the trial an hour or two into the game. It's pretty clever how they constructed this scene. The game is using Mode 1 with 3 background layers, though it doesn't look like it until you pull them apart. Layer 1 contains most of the courtroom and the window curtains. Layer 2 contains the window itself and the remaining parts of the courtroom. Interestingly, the people in the stands, which are animated to move now and then, are split between these 2 background layers. Finally, Layer 3 contains the light behind the window in a very specific pattern, designed to make it look like the sun shining through. Layers 1 and 2 are on the main screen, and Layer 3 is on the subscreen, and when these colours are added together, we get this great looking stained glass window effect. The next effect is another one you see fairly frequently during Chrono Trigger, and that's the warp screen when you're travelling back and forth between time periods through the gates. How do you think this is being done? Pause the video, make a comment, then resume to see if you are right. This is the first time we see Mode 7 being used during the game itself, but in what's going to be a repeated theme during this video, it's not as straightforward as you might think it is. You see, the Mode 7 portion of this is the swirling lines. The tile map looks like this, and it's actually being duplicated with a screen split on scanline 113, pretty much right across the middle of the screen, and there's no mirroring going on between the two halves. Mode 7 is being used to zoom the image on each half of the screen in and out in such a way as to create the effect of the lines warping. It's actually performing the same affine transformations in both halves, but the tile map is scrolling differently, gradually scrolling down in the top half while gradually scrolling up in the bottom half, creating a difference between them. The tile map periodically changes its palette so the lines alternate colours between purple and a teal-like colour to enhance this part of the effect. So hang on, if that's the Mode 7 part, then what about that spiralling blue pattern over the top of it? Believe it or not, that's entirely made up of sprites, and they are the maximum size available actually, which is 64 by 64, so only 16 of them are required to cover the whole screen. These are animated by cycling the colours in their palette to make it look like the spirals are moving outwards. These sprites are then placed on the subscreen, while the Mode 7 background is on the main screen, and colour averaging is applied to turn the spirals partially transparent. The way this is happening isn't the standard method either, because as you can see, the palette that's cycling is palette 8, which isn't one of the sprite palettes that actually supports colour maths. But all of the other sprite palettes are using the same set of colours, they just aren't alternating. The colour averaging would only be applied to palettes C to F. It's because this spiral pattern is comprised of a few different sets of sprite tiles that use different palettes, some of which use palette 8, which is the one that cycles, but some use palette 9, some use palette A, some use palette B, and some use palette D. That means only some parts of the pattern are being colour averaged to give it a very specific look. If you're at all confused about all this colour math stuff and what the palettes have to do with it, I explain it all in this video. There's one last piece to this, and that's the iris effect, as it appears at the start of the animation and disappears at the end. This is done using a window that's applied to both the background and the sprite layer that gradually gets larger. At the end of the animation, it's a normal window, so it's cutting a circular hole inside it to show the black backdrop colour behind it. At the beginning of the animation though, the window is inverted, so instead of cutting out what's inside it, it's cutting out what's outside it. By this point in the Super Nintendo's lifespan, developers really knew how to use the unique features of the hardware in really creative ways. How did you go with that one? Did you get it right? It's quite a meticulously constructed scene for something that only lasts a few seconds at a time. By the way, were you wondering how the animation of the characters going in and out of the gates was done? The gates themselves are actually sprites, set to the lowest possible priority, so when the player triggers the interaction, they appear behind all of the background layers, out of the player's vision. Once again, a circular window is used here to cut a hole in just the background layers to expose the sprite sitting behind them, with the process reversed to cover it back up before the sprite is removed from the screen. The characters also disappear because they switch to the lowest priority as well once they step into the gate, so they and the gate hide behind all the background layers when the window closes. Cool, huh? Alright, it's time to tackle the famous jet bike race scene. Let's get the obvious stuff out of the way first. Clearly this is using Mode 7, and is the first and actually only time we see it incorporated as part of gameplay. Unless you count the time zone selection screen. There's a screen split on scanline 57, with the top portion using Mode 1 to draw the skyline in the distance, and the bottom portion using Mode 7 to draw the road and the ground. It's a pretty standard usage, although it is somewhat unusual to have a side view like this rather than the view from behind, and the game allows you to zoom in and out. This is the default mode and the one you'll race on the first time, but if you collect the race log item after this race, you can challenge Johnny again in a different mode that removes the turbo boost but allows you to freely rotate the camera around. Interestingly enough, there's some more transparency effects going on in the top portion too, which is pretty rare to see in these kinds of setups. The mountains there are on the subscreen, so they appear translucent to make it look like they're covered in smog. Everything else you see on the screen, including the score at the top, the icons at the bottom, and the characters, are sprites. What certainly isn't standard is how those character sprites are scaling as they move closer or farther away from the camera. This isn't using the method of swapping in different sprite sizes. There's way too many different sizes and angles for this to all be stored in the ROM, and the transition is way too smooth for that. It's also not using the trick that we've seen previously, where the sprite tiles are overlapping. This is a case of genuine sprite scaling, but the Super Nintendo had no hardware to support this, so Chrono Trigger here is using an entirely software-based solution, with my best guess being a nearest neighbour scaling algorithm. It's not the most accurate solution, but it is quite efficient, and for the purposes of the game, it's close enough. Besides the Mode 7, which actually isn't all that CPU intensive on its own, there's not much else going on that would eat into CPU cycles, so the console is able to handle the software scaling of both of these sprites. Remember that Chrono Trigger did not use any kind of enhancement chip, so this is all being done on base hardware. If you're enjoying this content and would like to see more of it, make sure you subscribe so you know when I upload new videos. At this point, I'll make a tangent here to talk about the various tech or spell effects that are seen throughout the game, because quite a number of viewers left questions about these. For the record, the game uses Mode 1 for all of these effects. Many of them consist of a translucent shape of some kind, and if you've seen my previous videos, you might have put 2 and 2 together and figured out that these are created using windows, with the colour averaging applied inside them. The single circular ones are pretty easy, and are done basically the same way I explained how the power bombs in Super Metroid were done in this video. But you don't need to create circles, you can create many different shapes by altering the start and end positions of the window on each scan line. The Super Nintendo had 2 windows it could use for this purpose, and occasionally you see the game using both of them for effects like this one. With the game running at full speed, it looks like there's actually 4 windows, but if we slow it down and go frame by frame, we can observe that they are just alternating the window positions each frame to make it look like there's twice the amount. In areas like this example, where we see some environmental transparency effects happening, the game will temporarily disable them during some spells. Not only because the color match circuit needs to be used for the spell, but also sometimes because the background layer that would normally be put onto the subscreen for this purpose is instead used to add additional effects to the screen. Occasionally though, the effect is a bit more devious. For examples like this, both color windows are being used. The background palette's darkened to tint the screen, which is something that you might notice often happens during tech animations. Then there's color averaging happening inside the windows. See, when color mask is applied to windows, there doesn't necessarily need to be anything on the subscreen, and so far with the examples we've seen, that's been the case. But this one's different. The subscreen only needs to be used if you want to use color masks on backgrounds or sprites, and that's exactly what's going on inside the windows here. One of the background layers turns a solid color, in this case red, then that is put onto the subscreen, and color averaging is applied to turn it translucent and give the backgrounds a red tint. The windows, which are actually inverted for this animation, cut holes in this red background layer in the specified shapes, so the red is only applied to those shapes and not the whole screen. What about this one, which isn't translucent at all and is instead a number of different solid colours with gradients? This is a window again, in fact it's 2 windows combining to create this, one that forms the outer circle and one that forms the inner circle, cutting a shape in layers 1 and 2. The colours and gradients are created by modifying the background colour of layer 3 with HDMA, basically changing the colour of each scanline during H-blank. Then you have powerful text like this that look like the game's pushing huge polygons. How on earth are they making the Super Nintendo do this one? Well, if you saw my video where I cover Kefka's Pyramid in Final Fantasy VI, it's the same technique being used here, except it goes a step further because rather than just one window, Chrono Trigger is using both windows for this. One that forms the outer shape and one that forms the inner shape. The game is using the windows to only render one side of each shape per frame, but it changes what side of the shape is displayed every single frame, which we can see pretty clearly by slowing the game right down to go frame by frame. By slightly moving the position of each window on each frame, it creates the rotation. It even combines them with various colour averaging effects with background layers that we've already looked at to create something really spectacular. When running at full speed, it looks like there's just one big flickering shape. Keep in mind that on CRT TVs that this was originally designed for, the image would have looked more blurry, removing a lot of the flickering we see on modern HD displays. How about this one, Magus' most powerful spell? 2 windows are being used here again to create 2 triangles, a big one and a smaller one inside it, but there's no colour averaging happening this time. The big triangle is cutting out a shape in two of the background layers, leaving the third layer, normally hidden behind the others, visible, which is also scrolling. The smaller white triangle in the middle is cutting through everything, and is using the backdrop colour that's assigned to the subscreen, called the fixed colour, which here is set to white. It's using colour addition, but because there's actually nothing else to add colour to, it's completely white. Finally, we'll study this powerful dual tech with Luca and Mal. The blue flash at the start is pretty self-explanatory, that's a window again, but then the rest of the spell is doing something a little different. Background layers 1 and 2 are tinted red by changing their palettes, and are assigned onto both the main screen and the subscreen, where HDMA scanline interrupts are used to scroll individual scanlines back and forth to create the heat haze effect. The large yellow fireballs aren't sprites that are resizing though, they are actually on background layer 3 and are animated to do that, and are only assigned to the main screen. Colour addition is then done here, not averaging, to turn objects behind them a yellow colour. How you going keeping up with all this? I bet you're discovering there's way more going on behind the scenes in this game than you may have realised. Next up, we have this effect that happens after the first Magus fight, and there were specifically some questions that wanted to know about this. There's this weird semi-transparent, partially rotating mosaic copy of the background, and then during the sequence, a massive blue gate appears that sucks the characters into it. Well, we already basically know how the gate is done. It's the same trick from earlier in the video with the smaller gates, except here, the gate texture is a background rather than a sprite. The method of using a window to cut a hole to expose it and hide it is still the same though. So the mystery is what's happening with the rest of the screen. Because I just explained that the gate is a background in this case, we know this isn't using mode 7, as that only allowed one background layer. It seems like this particular effect is often mistaken for being mode 7, but I can assure you it's not using it. Like most of the rest of the game, this scene is using mode 1. One of the comments posited the theory that the room here is actually constructed entirely of sprites, but nope, that's not the case either. It is indeed a background tile map. So what do you think is happening? How are Squaresoft making the Super Nintendo do this? Pause the video, have a guess in the comments, then resume to see if you are right. So we've established the game is using mode 1, and we already know what background layers 2 and 3 look like. The final background layer, layer 1, is actually a copy of layer 2. It's duplicating the same room. Why on earth would the game be doing that? Because this layer is the layer the mosaic effect is being applied to. I haven't really spoken too much about the Super Nintendo's mosaic function, but it was a built-in feature of the hardware that allowed developers to easily create such an effect by setting a specific register, and it was available for use with all 8 background modes. It could be selectively enabled or disabled on any background layer, and provided 16 different levels of pixelation that they could cycle through. This is what's happening on background layer 1. The mosaic effect is gradually being applied from level 0 to level 7, then cycling back to level 0 and repeating. Layer 1 is also assigned onto the subscreen with colour averaging applied onto it, so it looks like a faded, semi-transparent copy of the room. As the scene progresses, it gets to the point where it looks like there is rotation happening. I've got to hand it to them, this is a really clever illusion they have created here. The tile map is animated to change its orientation every few frames, as well as zoom out, duplicate and zoom in. This actually doesn't take up as much room in the ROM as you might think it does, due to being able to reuse tiles. The faded look created by the colour averaging and the mosaic combined kinda covers up the obviously more coarse rotation. The tile map continues to swap to distorted variations as the gate appears and the scene eventually completes. How did you go figuring that one out? Anyone's head exploding yet? Once you acquire the Epoch, you'll travel to the Dark Ages, where you need to climb an area called the Mountain of Woe. If you look carefully as you ascend the mountain, you'll see there's a kind of spotlight with a moving pattern on it following you around, that appears to cut through the fog and allow you to see a bit better. It's pretty subtle, but it's definitely effective. What's happening in this case? Got any ideas? This weather effect in particular is worth pointing out, because it's not done the same way as the others you see throughout the game. Well, as you might have guessed, the colour matte circuit is being utilised again here, but this isn't colour averaging like we normally see with weather effects. This is actually colour addition, and it's being done a pretty interesting way, because the layers on the main screen and the subscreen are set up like this. One of them has an octagonal shape with an animated pattern inside it, which is comprised of two background layers, one for the shape and one for the pattern inside it. This inner pattern actually also scrolls as the player moves, as it's a background layer. Using color addition, rather than color averaging, doesn't create a transparency effect, but rather it adds the main screen and the subscreen in this specific way. The foggy effect around the outside of the octagon shape is created by adding the grey colour to the background, leaving the part inside the octagon to reveal the more natural colours with an added effect on top of it. A similar effect can be seen a little bit later in the game, when you peek through the vents as you sneak through the air ducts of the Blackbird airship. Except here, the main and subscreen are set up a bit differently, and it's using colour averaging rather than addition to create a distinct look. Not too much further past this part is another effect that several viewers left a question about. After you get the Epoch back and encounter Magus for the second time, you see this cutscene play out with the game's eventual final dungeon, the Black Omen, materialising above the ocean. There's two effects we see, a top-down shot from a distance and a front-on close-up. How do you think these two things were done? Pause the video, leave a guess in the comments, then resume to see if you are right. The top-down shot is very similar to the effect we saw a few videos back when we examined the shimmering camouflage effect of the Sting Chameleon boss in Mega Man X. Chrono Trigger is using more or less the same concept, except in this case, the Black Omen isn't a sprite, but a background layer. The layer on the subscreen is slowly scrolling diagonally while also being manipulated with HDMI scanline interrupts to create a wave. Color addition is also being used here, more or less just to combine the main screen and the subscreen together in this specific way, in combination with the layer that's being warped with HDMI to get the final result. Sprites are used to add those electric bolts to the effect. Occasionally you'll see the whole outline flash for a single frame. This is done with a palette swap. In fact, it's just two colours changing, indexes 1 and 2 of palette 0. The second part of this is even more interesting. For this shot, the colour math circuit is again doing some heavy lifting, using colour addition again combined with palette swaps to create the effect of the Black Omen fading in. However, that's not all the game's doing here. There's an additional effect going on to create a kind of horizontal stretching and contracting. But how? Vertical stretching and contracting is one thing, and we've seen a number of examples of games doing that in previous videos, and is pretty trivial with horizontal scanline interrupts. But something like this is almost like a vertical scanline interrupt, but there are no vertical scanlines. So what's it doing? Well, here's a big clue. The game switches into mode 2 for this angle. Why mode 2? Because as we saw right at the beginning of the video, this is one of the modes that supports offset per tile. Except it's not using vertical offset per tile like the title screen, this is using horizontal offset per tile. Yes, the Super Nintendo could do tile offsets on both axes, with a caveat. When using vertical offset per tile, the columns of tiles could be controlled down to the pixel, or down to the scanline to be more accurate. But when using horizontal offset per tile, the columns of tiles can only be shifted left or right by 8 pixels, or one tile width at a time. For this reason, it was used pretty rarely, unless they wanted to make an effect like this one. The background tile map actually normally looks like this, and they are using horizontal offsets to make the various tiles overlap each other and push back out again, while also combining in HDMI scanline interrupts to scroll scanlines at slight offsets to each other as well. You can see if we go frame by frame that each stretch or contract movement jumps by tile width. With all of the other stuff going on, this coarse movement is hidden pretty well. If you're interested, here's what the scene would look like with offset per tile disabled. As you can see, the horizontal tile offsets make a big difference. How well did you go guessing all of that? There's so many of the Super Nintendo special effects combining together in just this one cutscene to create something truly unique and spectacular. At this point, you have the option to fly the Epoch straight to the Apocalypse and fight Lavos, which invokes a unique cutscene that you won't see unless you do this. The team decide to crash the Epoch into Lavos to smash through his outer shell, skipping that first phase of the fight. Some shots of this cutscene are within the cockpit of the Epoch. Mode 7 is being used to render the ceiling and the floor, and on Scaling 169, it splits and switches to Mode 1 to draw the cockpit. The part of the cockpit that you see that's above this scanline is made up of sprites, as is the steering wheel. That's not really the interesting part of this though, as plenty of games do something similar to this. No, this is particularly fascinating because it's making use of the Super Nintendo's very rarely used interlacing mode. If you pause and look closely, you can see what look like gaps in the scan lines. In interlaced mode, it basically draws half a scan line on one frame, then draws the other half on the next frame, technically drawing the second frame of scan lines half a scan line lower. In doing so, it effectively doubles the SNES's vertical resolution over 2 frames. Normally, interlacing was only used in conjunction with the also rarely used high resolution modes, which only doubled the horizontal resolution, allowing a resolution increase in both directions. But Chrono Trigger is not doing that, so I'm guessing the interlacing here is just being used to create a specific flickering looking effect. It's using Mode 7 EXTBG too, but the priority bit isn't set like you normally see, so my educated guess is that swapping between the two layers created by this on alternate frames. Feel free to correct me on that if you believe I'm mistaken though. Interestingly, it stays in interlaced mode for the side angle shots too, indicating that they were going for a distinct visual style for this. We're not done with this yet though. The last remaining mystery is actually how it's generating that glow in the middle of the screen, which even has a gradient on it. The game isn't switching background modes here, it stays in mode 7 until it hits the bottom segment, and there's no windows being used either. Squaresoft are using the color math circuit again, but not in a usual way, because they aren't doing color averaging or addition against the background layer that's assigned to the subscreen. In fact, the subscreen is completely blank. What they are doing is performing the color maths against the subscreen's backdrop color, a color that is gradually changed on the per scanline basis to create the gradients at the top and bottom of the effect. It remains the same color right in the middle of the screen, between scanlines 112 and 131, but scanlines slightly above and below this are blended by using this method. As I mentioned earlier in the video, the subscreen's backdrop color is called the fixed color. At the end of the cutscene, this glow is pushed all the way to the top and bottom of the Mode 7 screen segment, before a palette swap is applied to the rest to transition out. And now we come to the end game. Before we get to the final battle with Lavos, I just want to draw attention to a couple of other effects. Firstly, this cutscene that actually appears a bit earlier in the game, but since it's technically after the first encounter with Lavos, it makes sense to include it here. It's the pivotal moment of the story when Lavos awakens in the Dark Ages. During this cutscene, when he destroys the floating islands, there's this funky horizontal wave pattern that's going on with the clouds in the background. The game is performing a number of HDMI scanline interrupts on this cloud layer to effectively split it into smaller segments. Then it performs some vertical stretching and contracting, while simultaneously vertically scrolling each segment up then down in an alternating pattern to give it the oscillating wave look. Secondly, we'll take a quick look at this 3D looking dome that's created in this cutscene after you defeat Queen Zeal on the Black Omen. You might have already figured this out, but this is a similar kind of effect to how some of the texts work. This is a 2-frame animation created using a window again. There's 2 different shapes that are quickly alternating, and this creates an optical illusion of the dome appearing to be 3D when the game is running at full speed. Alright, so now at last we reach the final battle against the Lavos core, and the background here is looking pretty trippy. There's a constant stream of psychedelic bolts that are animating towards the middle of the screen that also change colours, and behind that is a warped background image that changes as the battle progresses. I guess this is meant to represent that you are flying through time during this battle, or something to that effect. The game remains in mode 1 for the entirety of this fight. The psychedelic effect is created using a cycling palette, which is placed onto the main screen. The image behind is placed onto the subscreen, and colour addition is applied to tint it the same colour as whatever the psychedelic effect is using. Additionally, the layer on the subscreen is being warped in a wave pattern in the same way we saw earlier, by using HDMI to scroll individual scan lines at different rates and in different directions. This background image is swapped out for another one whenever Lavos uses his time warp move. Speaking of Lavos using moves, what about Evil Star? This moon phases in a pretty unique way by almost dripping down the screen before turning red, then is warped out of shape and finally split into many pieces that fly across the screen. How do you think Lavos is doing that? Have a guess in the comments, then see if you are right. The moon is a background layer, and it's just a normal circular shape, so all of the manipulation is being done by the hardware using HDMI tricks. The first thing it's doing when the moon appears is starting the moon vertically stretched out to an extreme degree by duplicating its scanlines over and over, which are gradually reduced down to normal. As it takes shape from the bottom up, the scanline where the stretching starts is moved up until it's fully formed. The moon's change to red is done using a palette swap. Colour indexes 9, A and B on palette 1 to be specific. The side-to-side warping is done by scrolling individual scan lines at different rates, which needs to be done in a very precise way. It's then broken apart by scrolling individual scan lines so far that they separate from the image, which then continue to scroll across the screen at varying speeds. After the whole screen flashes white, these lines continue to scroll across the screen. But now colour addition is being used as well, slightly highlighting the sprites behind them as the effect finishes, which is something you might not even notice unless you look really closely. Did you get all of that right? Squaresoft really used every trick in the Super Nintendo book with Chrono Trigger, and this fight is the pinnacle of that. There's one last thing worth mentioning about all of this, and that's the fact that for the majority of the game, Chrono Trigger has a black bar at the bottom of the picture. Apologies if you have subtitles on, you could need to move them out of the way to see it. You might have noticed that most of the time, from scan lines 212 to 224, it displays as completely black. The only parts where this isn't the case, as far as I could tell, is when you are on the world map, and the few places where the game uses Mode 7, like the jet bike race or the time zone selection screen when on board the Epoch. Yeah, that's using Mode 7, in a similar way to how the time warp animation used it, to do that funky background animation. So anyway, why is that black bar there everywhere else? There's plenty of other Super Nintendo games that don't have it, after all. Well, it's there to give the hardware just a little more time to do the necessary processing to draw each frame. V-blank is an extremely small amount of time, so this gives the system another 12 scan lines to do most of the stuff we've covered in this video. In doing so, it's able to maintain a rock-solid frame rate despite everything that could be happening. I don't believe the game ever experiences unintentional slowdown. So, there you go. Finally, remember that sprite scaling we saw back in the jet bike race? Well, it's fittingly being used here again in combination with Mode 7 during the credits that you see after one of the many possible endings, and is a great way to close off this incredible game. Thanks so much for going on this journey with me and sticking it out all the way to the end. This really did take a massive amount of work. Hopefully in doing so, I've answered everyone's technical questions about how Chrono Trigger's developers achieve such breathtaking visual effects. If you've ever wondered how classic games pulled off their various tricks, be sure to leave a question in the comments. Give me a thumbs up if you like this video, it really helps a lot, and don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with my content. Thanks for watching and see you next time.